السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another program of Gems of the Heart, where we look into our hearts and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify it. And these hearts are hidden from us. We know some things about it, but what we mean by the hearts is the way it's mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. This place of the matters of belief, the matters of actions done by the heart, the purification of the hearts, which is a duty to be done on the face of earth. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran, that only those who have pure and sound heart will enter the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. وَلَا تُخْزِنِي يَوْمَ يُبْعَثُونَ يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. That Ibrahim alayhi salam, he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not to disgrace him in the day of resurrection, when no children, no wealth will avail the person and benefit the person except those who would come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sound heart. So this is something that is very important for each and every one of us to pay attention to. And we need to make sure that it's filled with all means to purify it and to expel and to purify ourselves from all that is filth. There are bad and evil matters of beliefs, false beliefs. We have to protect ourselves from that. There's also evil actions that is done by the heart, and every physical action that is done physically with our bodies affect our hearts, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that. The sin, even if it's done physically, it makes or brings a black dot in the heart, and that's why we have to make sure that repentance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the job of the believers, but also not just to be concerned about the physical actions, but to understand that this has an effect to our hearts. And we've been mentioning or talking about matters of belief for a period of time. And we continue to do that inshallah ta'ala to show the effect of matters of aqeedah, matters of belief on our hearts, because that's the foundation. If a person is doing whatever of good deeds that he is doing, helping the poor, even reading Quran and doing all kinds of acts of worship and ibadah and dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the belief and the creed is not sound, is not correct. That means the heart is full of filth. No matter how much goodness and purity you add to it, the filth does not go away. So we have to make sure that matters of belief are correct, are sound, according to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, so that we can benefit from anything of goodness that we would add to ourselves physically, with our speech, with our actions, with the deeds that are supposed to be done for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. We've been talking about the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how that affects our hearts. And it's a subject that is a continuous one. We need to recite the Quran on a daily basis. And almost every verse in the Quran, many verses in the Quran, you would find them end with one or two of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And within the verses of the Quran talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. And the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is how we purify ourselves. And as Sheikh Taymiyyah rahimahullah and others, they said when you look into the Quran, the mention of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes is far more, of course, than the joy that people would receive in Jannah, for example. And this is something that shows the biggest joy ever for the believers in the Day of Judgment, is when they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result of them having the proper and sound belief in this heart, and they act according to it. And one of these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we will talk about briefly inshallah ta'ala today is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee'. Al-Badee' usually translated as the originator. And it's something that can have some close similarities to the meaning of Al-Khaliq, the creator, or Al-Bari' also comes in the meaning of the one that created his creation. Al-Musawwir, the one that fashioned people in specific ways. So these meanings can be close, but they're not the same. So Al-Badee' means the one that created everything without a previous example, without following a previous example or something that is being followed. As human beings, they do things based on what they have already seen before or learned before, and so on. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee'. His creation is without any previous example or like whatsoever. And this, for someone to reflect upon this is such an amazing meaning. Right? People can invent things. But imagine inventing something, this human being, ourselves, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. That means He created us from without any previous example. Imagine that, can we fit in any other way of creation? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in the most perfect way to fulfill the purpose of our life. And how, not just that, every single human being in their creation, you can see clearly the meaning of Al-Badee'. That means each and every one of us are unique. We are all unique. Billions of people, from the time of Adam alayhi salam till the day of judgment, all of the human beings present on the face of earth today, each one is unique. Nobody is the like, exactly like someone else. Even we know the fingerprints and so on. And this is all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the one that created each and every one of us, and each one can never be exactly similar to the other. That's such an amazing thing that makes a person, have this belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same thing with all of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee'. When we think, before we talk about the verses that talks about this name, the name Al-Khaliq, the creator, it gives the meaning that He's the one that created everything from nothing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator, and people were nothing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them from this Adam, from this nothing. They were nothing, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. So this is a meaning, and this is such an important meaning with regards to Al-Khaliq. He's the one that created us from nothing. Therefore, He's the one that is ought to be worshipped subhanahu wa ta'ala. We talked about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Khaliq. The name Al-Bari', one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Bari'. And the Al-Bari' is the one that created His creation without any contradiction. No contradiction in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whatsoever. There's no contradiction in the creation of Allah. Everything is created for its purpose, for its job to be fulfilled, and no contradiction whatsoever. And the name Al-Musawwir, the one that fashioned people in different ways, in different shapes, and different structures and so on, this is the meaning of Al-Musawwir. Al-Badee', Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee', the one that created His creation without a previous example. And that's also the word bid'ah. We heard it many times, innovation in matters of the deen. It's bid'ah. People inventing something that is not part of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioned in the Quran? It's very interesting to know that it's mentioned in 2 verses in the Quran, and it's being mentioned with regards to the heavens and the earth in a specific context. In the context of those who claimed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a son. When the people claimed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a son, the Christians, when they claimed that Jesus is the son of Allah, wal-'iyadhu billah, this is basically what the name Al-Badee' is mentioned in these contexts. And let's first see the first one, or the first verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 117. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَدِيعُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَإِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. Which means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is بَدِيعُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. He is the one that originated the heavens and the earth. He is the one that originated the heavens and the earth. وَإِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا, and if He decree a matter, فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. He only says for it to be, and it becomes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things. But the meaning here that we see is بَدِيعُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is بَدِيعُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And this meaning of Badii', that means He created them from no previous example whatsoever. If we look at the previous verse, just before that verse, what does it say? وَقَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا سُبْحَانَهُ بَلْ لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ كُلٌّ لَهُ قَانِتُونَ. وَقَالُوا, they said, اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took a son. Subhanahu, glory be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. بَلْ لَهُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. But instead, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala belonged to Him, what's in the heavens and what's in the earth. كُلٌّ لَهُ قَانِتُونَ. All of them in state of qunut and ibadah and obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. بَدِيعُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. He is the originator of the heavens and earth. So He is the one that originated and created Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, without a father. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam alayhi salam without a father and a mother. He's the one that made this. He is Badi'u samawati al-ard. He originated him without a previous example. There was no example. There was no like of Adam alayhi salam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him from nothing without a previous example. And Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him without a previous example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do all things. People usually, they are born when there's a father and a mother. And this is the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. But as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam without a father and a mother, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also is Al-Badee' when He created Isa alayhi salam, the son of Mary, without a father. And you see how the beautiful names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are so perfect that whoever does not have the proper belief in the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would invent these lies. Why? Because they think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the way they think about human beings. Because human beings, they have deficiency. They do not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless the matter is revealed to them through the messengers alayhimus salam. So human beings, they tend to have these false beliefs if they leave it to themselves. And they would think that this is a matter of intellect and so on. It doesn't work this way. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee', the one that creates things without any previous example. And as we see the human beings, how they are created, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam alayhi salam without a father and a mother. He created Isa alayhi salam without a father. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Most High. He's the one that originates everything. So that's why the ayah comes in this context that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Badi'u samawati wal ard. For anyone to start thinking, but how can someone is born without a father, without just a mother? You know, how that happened? How did she conceive this child to be, and so on? Badi'u samawati wal ard. The matter is very easy and simple. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the originator of all things. وَإِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا, and that's the point here. وَإِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا. If He decree a matter, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides a matter, what is then difficult for Allah? Everything is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He owns everything. He's the creator of all things. فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونَ. He only says to it, kun, be, and it becomes. And this is how amazingly is the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we look into the other verse that talks about this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee', this is in Surah Al-An'am. Surah Al-An'am, verse number 101. Verse number 101, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in it, بديع السماوات والأرض أنى يكون له ولد ولم تكن له صاحبة وخلق كل شيء وهو بكل شيء عليم. So the same meaning again is mentioned here, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala بديع السماوات والأرض, the originator of the heavens and the earth. أنى يكون له ولد. That means how could he have a son? أنى, something far off to happen. There's no way it would happen. This is impossible. How could he have a son? وَلَمْ تَكُنْ لَهُ صَاحِبَةً, when he does not have a companion. He does not have a wife. He does not have a companion. He does not have a son. وَخَلَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, and He created everything. All things are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٍ, and He is of all things knowing subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, since He is Badi'u samawati wal ard, then how can then people attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He has a son and the like of these false beliefs? And this is one of the things that we see from contemplating and having the proper belief in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Al-Badee', is to contemplate over the creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that from us. He ordered us in the Quran to reflect and to think. And that's why those who have these false beliefs, if they would reflect and think and use their fitrah, their pure nature, and the proper intellect, they would see the matter so clear that there is no way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have a son. He does not need a son. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things, and everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee', the one that originates everything without a previous example subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if we look into Surah Al-An'am that this verse was revealed in, the entire surah is about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's about the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in worship and using the proper and the clear evidences. And that's the way of the Quran, the way of the truth. For people to see the names and attributes of Allah, to see the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His creation. And when people think and they see and they look at the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then they would have the proper belief that there's no one worthy of worship except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the only one to be worshipped. He has no son, he has no companion, he has nothing whatsoever except that he's the creator of the heavens and the earth, and everything else is basically his creation. We're all the creation of Allah. The prophets of Allah, the best men ever walked on the face of earth, are creation of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. And therefore they are in need of Allah. That's how they reach this level of superiority, when they have this need inside of them, where they then become the most of all of the human beings in the worship of Allah and obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fulfilling the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He sent them with. That's why then when we look into the verse that we just recited in Surah Al-An'am, before it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the creation of Allah and how He created whatever on the heavens and in the earth and all the details of what's in the plants and the sea and how things grows and how things, when it comes to the provisions and the different types of fruits and vegetables and all kinds of things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for the human being, again without a previous example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have created us in a different way to sustain our life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in such a way that all serves the perfect purpose, and that is to worship Him alone subhanahu wa ta'ala and all of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provided for us. As you see here, verse number 99 in Surah Al-An'am, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَهُوَ الَّذِي أَنزَلَ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ مَاءً فَأَخْرَجْنَا بِهِ نَبَاتَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. The ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that brought down from the heavens or from the skies water, and He brings down up out of it the nabat, the plants of all things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings from it the green and brings from it all of these different grains, and from the palm trees and the different trees and vegetables and fruits and so on. They look alike and they're not look alike. All of this is by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And these are ayat, these are signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not for everybody to take benefit of it, because many people, they see these signs of Allah and it doesn't affect them. Why? Because they did not have the proper way to receive these ayat from Allah. That's why when we're saying we need to pay attention to what's in our hearts, we have to put things in our hearts. When a person look into the signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a person should see it from the perspective that this is the creation of Allah, that's something that reminds us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that makes us humble ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the heavens and the earth. But then after all of this, in the previous verses also talks about that, it shows that how human beings are so ungrateful. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَجَعَلُوا لِلَّهِ شُرَكَاءَ الْجِنَّ وَخَلَقَهُمْ وَخَلَقُوا لَهُ بَنِينَ وَبَنَاتٍ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى عَمَّا يَصِفُونَ. That they, after all of this and after seeing the ayat and the signs from Allah, that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all these things, they take or they make with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala partners from the jinn, and He's the one that created them. And they would attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sons and daughters without knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to be glorified. He's above all of what they attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He's Badi'u samawati wal ard. He's the one that created the heavens and the earth without any previous example. And again, أَنَّا يَكُونُ لَهُ وَلَدٌ, something that a person should stop at and reflect. Anna means far off. There's no way, it's impossible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have a son, and He does not have a companion. وَخَلَقَ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, and He is one that created all things. وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. If we look right after this, ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ فَاعْبُدُوهُ وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٌ. This is what it means here to understand the purpose of all of this. This is your Lord. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your Lord, with these attributes. La ilaha illahu. That means there's no one worthy of worship except Him. خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ فَاعْبُدُوهُ. He's the creator of all things, then worship Him alone subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He is the wakil upon over all things. That means He's the one to be trusted, and He's the one to running the affairs of all of the human beings and so on. And therefore, show how the importance of believing in the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار وهو اللطيف الخبير. That nobody can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and encompasses this in this life, of course. In the hereafter, the believers will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Latif al-Khabir, and more and more. But the point here is that we understand from the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee', that He is the one that created things, the heavens and the earth, without a previous example, without any example whatsoever, nothing of the like of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for people to worship Him alone and to humble themselves. And again, this is one of the very strong points of matters of belief and inviting those who are Christians to the deen of Islam, to invite them to the truth, to invite them to the way of the Prophet ﷺ, the way of Isa ﷺ, the way of all of the prophets of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is the like of Him, and He's the one to be worshipped subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do not associate partners with Allah. Do not attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala something that He did not attribute it for His own self. They believe in the names and attributes of Allah the proper way. This is something that makes a Muslim upon the truth, and that's one of the major difference between Islam as a true religion and all of the distorted and man-made changes in the previous books and previous revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because we have a perfect names and attributes to Allah. If a person believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the perfect way, he would not attribute to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala these evil things that some people they do, like attributing a son to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or attributing, for example, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He doesn't know, or He doesn't care about His creation, or He created them and left them. All these types of evil thoughts that people have, it's because they do not know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His perfect names and attributes, and it's by the mercy of Allah. We have this in so much details, in so much comprehensive way in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We'll continue inshallah ta'ala with the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee', and how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala according to that name after the break. So stay with us inshallah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen, nabiyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome back, and we're talking about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee'. And as we heard, it means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the originator of all things, the creator of all things without a previous example, something that is we cannot really comprehend. We're so limited as human beings, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the perfect names and attributes. And we heard how that these the verses of the Quran that talks about Al-Badee', or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Al-Badee', is mentioned in the context of those who claim that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a son, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most glorified. There is not something that befits His majesty and His power subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the same way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala originated Adam alayhi salam, created him without a previous example, without a father and a mother, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Isa alayhi salam without a father. And this shows the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's mentioned again as we heard in the Quran. How can we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His name Al-Badee'? We know that all of the names and attributes of Allah, we have to have the proper belief in them, and we talked about that many times because this is the foundation. We believe in all of them, we know the meanings of them. We do not go beyond what is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore the essence of how these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are, we do not know, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only revealed to the Prophet ﷺ what He revealed in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So we believe in them without no similarities, no resemblance whatsoever. Nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and without any distortion to the meanings of it or twisting the meanings of it and so on. And also part of knowing the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can that affect our hearts and our actions? That means how can we worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? First of all, the matter of belief that a believer believes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee', drives us and makes us really reflect upon the creation of Allah. We need to spend more time thinking and reflecting when it comes to the creation of Allah, and also to the book of Allah and the verses of the Quran and so on, because these are all signs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to look into ourselves and see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in such a miraculous thing, and how the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very complex, and how this is something that it shows the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So as the verses in the Quran talks about the creation of Allah for us to reflect upon it and to increase our iman when we look at it and we see how the creation of Allah, all of it in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that increases one's iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the believers when they're like this. He said, الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. See how it's related, closely related. The believers, who are the believers? Those who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with, those who make remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, standing, laying down, sitting, and they are in that state of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they reflect, وَيَتَفَكَّرُونَ, they reflect in the creation of the heavens and the earth. They think about the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then as a result of seeing the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His creation, they would say, رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا سُبْحَانَكَ فَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. Rabbana, our Lord, you did not create this batilan. This is not false. This is not in vain. It's created for a reason. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then shield us from the hellfire. The very important message here in this verse, many people, they look into the heavens and the earth. They look at the creation of Allah. But they're not reflecting. They're not thinking in the proper way. Why? Because it's not leading them to this conclusion. What the proper conclusion is that this magnificent and powerful creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala leads the one that really reflects and think about it to one thing and one thing only. And that is, it's not created for play. It's not created from nothing like this. It's created for a great reason. The one that created the heavens and the earth, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did not create it for this, for play. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, that ما خلقنا السماوات والأرض وما بينهما لاعبين, that we did not create the heavens and the earth for play, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it for a great reason, and therefore the believers would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to shield them from the hellfire. So this is one important aspect when it comes to how to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this name Al-Badee, to reflect upon the creation of Allah. That this reflection is not that we waste our life just reflecting, it's a reflection that would make the person make dhikr of Allah, make ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. The salah will be different, our dhikr will be different. As it's mentioned in the verse, we will make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone and so on. Increase our iman, makes us shy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to commit sins and so on. All of that as a result of reflecting upon the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee, and nothing is the like of Allah. We as human beings, we are limited, we are deficient as we said, but in the worldly life that we live in, even when matters of whatever we have the capacity of, we should do the best we can to basically articulate and to be perfect in whatever position or job or knowledge or whatever there is that we're doing. We should do it in the most perfect way to the best of our ability. Of course, as long as it's halal and it's permissible. Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu, he said, قِيمَةُ كُلُّ امْرِئٍ مَا يُحْسِنُهُ, which means the value of each person is what he's good at. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for you to be in a position, a specific position in your life at the moment that you are in today or these days or these years or whatever, be good at it. Do it the best you can. Of course, the most important thing is the ibadah and the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so on. But someone working as a doctor, someone is a carpenter, someone is whatever position that a person is in, you should do the best you can in your profession for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That a person is trustworthy, buying and selling, be having the amana and the trustworthiness and the like of this. And this is something that whether a person can see the relationship here or not, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee, and He wants from us to do things in the right way. If you have a contract between yourself and someone else, you're hired by a company, you're hired by someone to do a specific job, it's part of your faith and belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you would fulfill these covenants in the most perfect way. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. O you who believe, fulfill the uqud, the covenants. And what and how many covenants we have in our life. You know, you're buying something, you're working for someone. The relationship between the husband and wife, this is a heavy contract, heavy covenant, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called it, mithaqan ghalidhan. It's a heavy one. That means a person will be asked about it in the day of resurrection. So to perfect these relationships, to live these relationships according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. Are we going to be perfect at all times? Of course not. We're weak, we fall into sins, we make mistakes, and therefore we have to keep on correcting ourselves and repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and keep on evolving to purify ourselves and to complete ourselves, and also to forgive those who do not fulfill our rights in the most perfect way, because they're humans and we are humans, and we would expect others to forgive us the way that we want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us, and we would forgive others and so on. So doing the best we can, and seeking forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking some excuses for the people when they fall short in fulfilling whatever rights we have and so on, so that people will have the ability to live together. Otherwise they won't be able to. When a husband expects a certain ways from his wife, and the same thing from the wife to the husband, they will end up divorcing each other. Why? Because human beings, they have weaknesses and deficiencies. We should forget about all of these expectations. A person should do the best he can, and then people need to forgive, need to pardon, and life goes on. And things with mercy and with goodness, and as long as the person is holding fast to matters of the deen, things can change to what is better, inshallah ta'ala. So another benefit here is to do the best we can, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created His creation in the perfect way. We have to do in whatever in our capacity to do it in the most perfect way according to our levels as human beings. Another great benefit, and there are many, if we just keep on reflecting upon this, the word Al-Badee reminds us of a word that we hear many times, which is Al-Bid'ah. Al-Bid'ah means innovation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee. When it comes to innovation, the word innovation, it sounds very nice. And human beings, they have innovations, right? In what field basically they innovate in? In the physical matters, in science, in technology, in airspace, in all of these types of things that they have the physical means. They can innovate even though they're not really innovating. They are just using the creation of Allah to discover part of the creation of Allah, and to use it by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for their own benefit, and all of that is by the qadr and the power of Allah. So, but this is something good from the human beings to do, and they excel, mashallah, so many ways, and many beautiful ways. Sometimes it's destructive with things that kills people and so on and so forth. But for overall, there's so much amazing things that the human beings can do, and they learn from one another. And from one generation to the other, they evolve from one generation to the other. And they're good at this part. But when it comes to matters of belief, when it comes to matters of ibadah, when it comes to matters of what is right and what is wrong, what is halal, what is haram, there's no room here for innovation. This is something to be left to the revelation from Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created us, and He's the one that knows best what's best for us. So we should humble ourselves that we limit our innovation, if it's correct to say that, to matter of physical sciences and so on. But when it comes to matters of deen, we are ordered to follow. So can someone invent their own beliefs, for example? If someone that is very intellectual, the most intellectual person on the face of earth, can that person and few others with him, or the entire humanity, get together to decide about a beautiful faith that they can make up the articles of faith for it and so on? They would fail miserably. Why? Because they don't have this capacity. We have to receive that from above, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's exactly like how we are created to receive light from the outside to be able to see in front of us if it's dark. You don't have a self-inspiring light that would comes out from your forehead or from your eyes that makes you see in front of you when it's dark. You need something external, not from within our own selves, to be able to physically walk in a dark place. The same way when it comes to guidance. Guidance, we don't have it in ourselves. We have things in our fitrah. We have things in our innate that would make the matter very clear to us when the truth is being presented to us. But we need to receive these means of guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's the job of the wahy, the revelation from Allah, the messengers of Allah and the books that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed for people to follow. So therefore, it is not permissible for someone to innovate in the deen, matters of religion, matters of belief, matters of ibadah. Can someone says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me the ability to think, and thinking and intellect is such a powerful thing. So life changed now and we're living in a more fast-paced and so on. So can someone say instead of praying 5 times a day, let's make it only 4 times a day? Or instead of 4 rak'ah, make it 3 rak'ah or 2 rak'ah? Or add a rak'ah, for example, in the morning, instead of 2, make it 4. All of this, can it be valid? Of course not. Their salah would not be valid, and not just that. It basically takes a person outside the fold of Islam, because this is a matter of revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that as we know, the ummah of the Prophet ﷺ have consensus among each other about this. And the same thing in all of the matters of deen. It is not permissible for someone to invent matters of belief. We know that how there are deviant sects that deviated from the truth that was present at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions radiallahu anhum, when they start inventing their own beliefs. The same way the Jews and the Christians did before to the truth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to Musa alayhi salam and Isa alayhi salam, a group of this ummah of the Prophet ﷺ would split in the same manner. They would add things from their own selves. They would have false beliefs and so on. There's no basis to it whatsoever in the revelation from Allah, and they would justify it for themselves. And that's why there's no room for innovation when it comes to matters of belief. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and it's perfect. There's no hidden things in it. There's nothing missing in it whatsoever, and it's perfect. And the same thing with matters of actions, matters of ibadah, matters of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We do not invent anything. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee. Even these rulings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to observe, it's without a previous example. You know, this is the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and these are the rules from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Human beings, when they decide set of rules and so on, and then after some times they would discover how terrible these rules are or laws, and they start changing and tweaking and things of that nature. Why? Because they see how in fault they have, and they keep on changing and evolving, and so on, never ends. And what used to be something that is very evil and forbidden, and people will go to prison for, and they would serve many, many years if they break the law as a result of doing a specific action. Nowadays, for example, you would find the same action is something that is valid for them, lawful. There's no harm whatsoever. You know, human beings, how they can contradict themselves so much. And therefore, we need to be consistent when it comes to the revelation from Allah, the wahy from Allah. So matters of aqeedah, matters of belief, matters of ibadah, matters of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how to make dhikr, how to worship Allah, has to be according to the way the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And that's part of believing really in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Badee, is the innovator, the one that originates everything without a previous example. And we need to follow the deen of Allah and the revelation from Allah. Because of the time, one of the things also that is worth mentioning is the dua that the Prophet ﷺ used to, or mentioned in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet ﷺ, he heard a man making dua, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying in this dua, Allahumma inni as'aluka bi anna laka alhamd. La ilaha illa anta wahdak, la sharika lak, al-mannan, بديع السماوات والأرض لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك المنان بديع السماوات والأرض ذو الجلال والإكرام. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he heard this dua, he said لقد سأل الله باسمه الأعظم. He have asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the ism of Allah, the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-A'zam, the greatest name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, الذي إذا سئل به أعطى وإذا دعي به أجاب. The name that if he's asked by this name, he will give. And if he is making dua, person is making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with this name, he will be accepted from him. So this dua, in it is the mention of Badi'u samawati wal ard, the one that originates the heavens and the earth. And this dua, as we heard it, it means, oh Allah, I ask you by virtue of the fact that all praise is due to you, none has the right to be worshipped but you alone, and you have no partner or associate, the bestower, the originator of the heavens and the earth. the possessor of majesty and honor. So the Prophet ﷺ told him he has asked Allah by his greatest name, which if he is asked thereby he gives, and if he is called upon thereby he answers. So making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala using the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, the dua, Allahumma inni as'aluka bi anna laka alhamd. Allah, I ask you that indeed you have alhamd. That means you're the owner of all praise. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, la ilaha illa anta wahdak. That means you're the only one. There's no one worthy of worship except you alone. Al-Mannan, the one that is the bestower of all things to the people. Badi'u samawati wal ard, the originator of the heavens and earth. Dhul jalali wal ikram, which means the possessor of majesty and honor. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to use this in our dua. Alidhu biyadha al-jalali wal ikram, to use frequently dhul jalali wal ikram in your dua. And to use these names and attributes of Allah in the dua, which is a great benefit for those who know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes. Great benefit of why we should know the meanings of it, because you would use it in your dua. If a person is making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to provide for him, he would use the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Razzaq. Oh Allah, the Ar-Razzaq, the provider, provide for me. And the like of this. So the same thing here with these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be used in matters of the dua, in matter of supplication and turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely. This is part of learning these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another point here also that we need to benefit from the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Badee, is basically in our ibadah, in our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perfected these matters of ibadah, matters of worship. That these acts of worship by itself is sufficient by the will of Allah to change our life. If a person wants to be steadfast upon the deen of Allah and to be obedient to Allah and ask, how can I do this when there's so many fitan and temptations and things that takes a person away from the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you submit yourself to the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered us to do, and turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone with dua. But these acts of worship is sufficient by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to change the person, to make him upon the straight path, upon what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him, because this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for the human beings to be upright. And therefore, without putting our own intellect on the way, we would rather fulfill the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And how that we can really change our life with these names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is what really matters, and this is what we need to seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to put these realities in our heart. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who understand and act according to these names and attributes of Allah. Until next time, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect you all. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.